Hey guys, what's going on? So, a lot of people still don't seem to understand the differences between the mods and what makes Icy Heaven Heaven and the other mods Hell, Tellurian based mods to be specific. So, I'm just gonna go point by point and try to detail my case as best as I can. The first point we're going to be looking at is the flow of gameplay throughout the game. So, this refers specifically to things like level 2 loners, level 2 flyers, level 2 charge attack, all of these things that were previously locked to level 3 and above that Tellurian has moved down to level 2. So what this does is it completely destroys the flow of gameplay as you're starting a game, as you're building out your base. You start with just a few henchmen, you get some lightning rods, you get a creature chamber, you're building workshops, and during that, there's a certain flow to it. You know what to expect. You know if your enemy wants to make an army, it's going to cost him a few hundred coal. You know, to make 4 or 5 creatures, enough to actually take out a group of henchmen.
Hello.
Because in the early game, the main resistance, if your opponent is just teching up and building resources, and you're doing an aggressive push, your resistance is going to be henchmen. Like, even if your opponent isn't making an army, he's making henchmen, right? So really the creatures you need to attack is like the minimum force required to defeat a squad of henchmen. Now
Hello.
I have 6 henchmen here, which would be manning like a 3 coal pile expo, which is pretty much on the smaller side of what an expo is. Now to kill these, you'd need probably 4 melee creatures, something like that. 3 or 4 melee creatures would be able to defeat these henchmen, and that would cost maybe 400 or 500 coal. But a loner changes that drastically. Having a loner at level 2, for less than 200 coal and 100 electricity, probably a third or even a quarter, yeah, or maybe like a third of the cost of the amount of creatures I would take to fight this. I just make one of these, and then I can make 3 of these, and I can just send them to each of your expos. And suddenly, there's no way you can hold all of your expos. And in the meantime, I'm not making any army at home. I'm just making these level 2 loners, sending them at your bases, and all I'm doing is making henchmen and expanding. And what this does is drastically changes the way you have to play, because if your opponent has this, you cannot expand normally. You really have to hunker down, expand slower, make sounding towers, and make creatures. So what this does is simply the fear of the loner changes drastically the way you play in the early game. It shifts the meta, and it causes an unhealthy, like, that's what hell really is fear of things that drastically changes your mode of being. That's what hell is, and that's what level 2 loners do to you. Because now, just the fact that they're in the game, whether they're even present in the actual game or not, will drastically change the way you play the early game. And then if your opponent ended up not having a level 2 loner, then it's a huge waste. You changed your whole playstyle for no reason. But there's no way to know until you actually load into the game. Um, So, like, when the presence of one creature can drastically change the way you should play the game, that is unhealthy. That's a toxic meta, because it just drastically changes how you're gonna play it. Just the fear of the loner. You have to play much differently to account for this one thing, and that really alters the flow of the early game, and it makes it impossible to have a proper match where both players are able to expand normally through the early game and then really have a proper even battle, because something like this can drastically shift the scales. Even just the fear of it, obviously having it can force your opponent to hunker and turtle, but then even the fear of it can cause that fear in your mind to not be able to play the game normally. Now, just
Ready,
for an
boss.
example, we can
All right.
have this loner.
The critters are under
Because
attack.
the thing is, in the early game, you're not really gonna be able to have armies on all your bases. Like, you're making henchmen, you're making workshops, you're spending your coal there. Um, Sound Wind Towers are quite expensive in the early stages of the game, so just having one creature able to take out an entire base is too low of an investment for what it can do, and it just alters the meta too drastically, so it's unhealthy for the meta. At level 3 is fine. I do think when they added loners back in Insect Invasion, putting it to level 4 was a smart decision because they were being safe rather than sorry, you see? That's the difference between the original IC developers' balancing vision versus what Tellurian has done. Is the original devs were always more concerned with balance than just doing things. So they're always going to be rather too careful than just letting things go too crazy. So level 4 was a good decision back then, but I do think level 3 is fine. Level 3 loners are fine because by that time, you've had chances to get a few creatures at all of your bases, get some defenses up, and at that point the game is more in a state of open battle. We've got flyers, we've got poison, charge attack, and loner fits in nicely with that. So for that reason, I have moved loner down to level 3, but it will not be made a level 2. Level 2 loners would be too OP as far as my understanding of the game balance is, and it would too drastically alter the way people have to play the early game. But, you can still make these spammy level 3 loners and go fast level 3 and still send them out while your opponent's still at level 2. All of those plays can still be done. We do have Fox with the loner ability now, which is super fun. And yeah, that covers that point. Level 2 flyers, very similar. Just the presence of a level 2 flyer will have to drastically change how you play. Put up anti-air towers, which are a huge coal investment in the early game. You have to defend against lab rushes. There's no lab defense that early in the game. It just ruins the game. Like, it truly makes IC from heaven into hell, because heaven is that state of perfect balance. When the early game, you know what's happening, you're expanding, building your base, you're setting up for the big battles to come. But then something like level 2 loners and level 2 flyers can entirely ruin that, and it's quite sad. So flyers and loners will be capped to level 3 on IC Heaven, and that's the correct way things should be. Now let's go to our next point, which is the cost formulas. I'm going to go into the army builder to explain this one. And this really specifically applies to abilities, and I'll be using Electric Burst as an example. It's one of those abilities that, classic quintessential IC ability. That's really great as an example for how this principle would work. So here we've got a moose. It's got an electricity cost for its horns. And another thing very interesting actually before I go on to the electric burst. So, okay, 0 elect creature. I add the moose horns, 55 electricity. Now, whether I reduce the damage of the creature, the horns still costs 55 electricity. The horns has a static cost. Compared to Tellurian, where all abilities cost, the electricity cost is scaled by the stats of the creature. So the cost of the horns would change depending on if they had the cheetah's claws or not. But that is actually a really bad idea because you're already paying for the claws in the coal cost. The original game, you already pay for all stats in coal, and then ability costs are in electricity. What Tellurian does is essentially make electricity and coal the same thing. So all ability costs are scaled by the stats. So there's not even a point, and even the fact that they made conversion 80% is this part of the same thing. They've made electricity and coal completely interchangeable, which really drastically takes out the resource management part of the game. But even specifically when talking about cost formulas, it takes out the creativity of the game because creatures just become a set of numbers. Okay, whatever stats the creature has, you'll pay for that. Instead of if you make a clever creature and then add a smart ability, you can sort of exponentially gain the value of that ability without just it being a static thing. So let's once again go to that electric burst. Now on Insect Invasion, electric burst has a set cost per level. So a level 4 electric burst will always cause 110 electricity. This would not have been the case on Tellurian. On Tellurian, the cost would have scaled based on your damage, your speed, your health, all these things. But that is actually a problem because what the original game rewards you for making the perfect creature to slap that electric burst on to make use of it. On Tellurian, it doesn't matter. You can make 10 cheap creatures and put a cheap electric burst or one expensive creature, and it doesn't matter. It takes out the complete creativity and sort of the agency of you as the army builder. I'll try to explain this, but let's say you make a creature that is okay. Let's say you make this creature. Okay, you put your electric burst on there. 110 electricity cost. It's a tank. It has charge attack. It's tanky, so it's going to be able to go in groups, charge into the enemy, get close, and use that electric burst. So you are being rewarded. You're not being charged extra for making a creature that's going to be able to use that electric burst properly. You're actually rewarded for coming up with ways to use that electric burst properly. On Tellurian, that's why spam is so good, because everything just gets cheaper for no reason. On Tellurian, what you could do is instead of making this clever creature, you just take something fast, perhaps, or something cheap. Say you take a giraffe. You make this guy. Alright, you slap the E-burst on it. And the electric burst here would get much cheaper. Instead of 100, this would cost, relatively it would be less, like half. So there will be no difference between making 10 of these or one of the strong guys. But here, like, you're encouraged and you're incentivized to think strategically about where you're applying the abilities. Putting that horns on a nice creature with high damage, good tankiness that's going to be able to get into battle is actually going to be worth more than just slapping horns and a bunch of cheap tanks. This actually even affects things like the tanks that were so popular in Tellurian, such as the let's find our Musk Ox, and then let's slap that shield bug. So something like this was so effective in Tellurian because the horns would get cheaper based on it having low damage. But now the horns cost the same amount no matter what. The cost of the horns does not change based on the damage of the creature, which means if you're choosing to apply horns on a tank, you're choosing to pay the cost of horns on a low damage creature. So you really have to find ways to make use of it creatively. And even when you're putting horns on a high damage creature, once again, you're not paying extra just because that creature is stronger. You're paying the same cost for the horns, and then you have the ability to actually exponentially gain the value of those horns. And horns being an offensive ability is designed for those offensive creatures, and it shouldn't be costing extra just because you're using the ability as designed. Now this point is a bit complex, so I want to just restate it at the end in a very abstract way. Insect Invasion has static electricity costs, not scaled by the stats of the creature, which means that you get rewarded for finding the right stat combinations to combine that ability. Whereas with Tellurian, it's more of a gray goo scenario where all the creatures are just biomass, and it's all interchangeable biomass, because the costs get adjusted anyway. So, you can put your horns on a high defense, high damage creature, and the cost will get scaled up. You can put it on a low damage creature and the cost will get scaled down. So it kind of doesn't matter because the cost gets scaled anyway. So your creative agency is taken out of the picture, and like the army builder does all the cost balancing and the effective balancing for you, instead of you as a player finding the creative and ways to exponentially scale the impact of the abilities by putting it on the right statted creatures. Okay, I hope that I explained that well. But let's now move on to the next point. Novelty value versus fundamental balance. So Tellurian and Tellurian-based mods, what they've gone for is lots of novelty. They've added all these crazy creatures, squids, new abilities, overpopulation, with no thought for how it's going to affect the fundamental balance of the game. Something like overpopulation, for example, it really drastically breaks the game. Especially in the early game, everyone has seen the level 2 and the level 1 overpop rushes and all what that does. When you can, in the early game, a creature chamber is a significant investment. So when you can double your opponent's output with just one creature chamber, it just breaks the game. It's just another one of these stupid rushes, just like a level 2 loner, a level 2 flyer, that just destroys that tightrope of flow of gameplay. Just adds extra things that you now have to be concerned about. Like if it's in the game, you'd have to play drastically different. There should be no abilities or creature types that if your opponent has, it should drastically change your fundamental gameplay and early game build orders and all of that. Because that's like Icy Heaven is like a state of balanced IC where it's like chess. You have your early game build orders in chess and you can play them regardless of what your opponent does. There shouldn't be early game builds or tactics that can drastically destroy the solid fundamental build orders that you're bringing to the game. And Overpop is just another one of those things that's just unbalanced. It forces you to drastically play different when it's in the game, and then even when it's not in the game, you have to be worried about it being in the game, and it's just in your head, and that's the voice of Satan being given voice and being amplified. That's what all of these little things that break the game, these little novelties, that's what they do. That's why these Tellurian-based mods are hell, because they're amplifying the voice of Satan, which is uncertainty, confusion, imbalanced rushes, the feeling of unfairness, unjustness. And Satan wants you to live like that. Satan doesn't want you to have a state of the game that is balanced, smooth, stable, because that's heaven. That's what God wants for you. And that's what Icy Heaven is designed along the lines of. And you're really able to make use of all of these things, flyers, loners, all of these things have a place in the meta without breaking your game, without coming in at level 2 and destroying your early game build order, without, overpop rushes and all these crazy things. And everything is just beautiful and amazing. So I urge you all to try Icy Heaven. It truly is Icy Heaven on Earth. It really is amazing. And on the next patch, I will be adding a few more of the dinos. The Stegosaurus will be added. The Panoplosaurus and the Pachycephalosaurus. These 3 will be added in the next patch. So keep a lookout for that. And I hope you're all gonna be able to free yourself from hell and free yourself from living and playing a state of IC that's full of fear and unbalanced things and chaos and confusion, and get to a place of stable, balanced IC, because it's really possible, it's really here, and it's really, really amazing.